I kind of titled this A Christmas Carol, in prose being an AI story of Christmas. Now, of course, this is entirely inspired by the great original work. We're all kind of familiar with it. It's part of our festive kind of moment, isn't it, really? And I thought I'd start then, of course, with the book itself. It starts off, Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. And now, since this is an AI story of Christmas, I'll let AI take over. He had no, I'm sorry for you to be heard when he died. He had no forehead to be furrowed when he lay in his coffin, no eyes to shed tears for him. He had no lips to speak words of grave significance. He had no body to be reduced to ashes or blood to be spilt upon the ground for him. There he was, dead as a doornail. Marley was dead as a doornail. Well, there you go. That's actually really quite plausible, you have to say. But of course, nowhere close to what Dickens actually wrote. But this is from a version of GPT-2 based on Elon Musk's OpenAI initiative. It's a neural network that's trained on billions of pages of material from the internet. And it uses our collective authorship to find patterns. It uses prodigious amounts of computing. And the latest GPT-3 has been freaking some out as it's written articles for The Guardian about the nature of AI. And it's just been exclusively licensed to Microsoft. Now, very plausible, but nowhere close, as I say, to what Dickens himself wrote. He carries on, mind. I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile. And my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. Will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now, whilst GPT-2 and 3 impresses with its ability to discern patterns and connected text that seem entirely reasonable given the millions of pages of human authored content, it is our own authorship, interests and goals in writing text that have given meaning to the patterns inferred and the text represented. And what of the plot line? This requires a guiding mind, and whilst given enough plotline examples to learn over, our AIs might assemble complete stories. Always remember that they are our plot lines, our purposes, and our interests. And we're often very easily persuaded to see the intelligence in other systems. We're often disposed to make sense of the world in terms of purposes. If not ours, then perhaps the gods, or if not ours, then perhaps artificial intelligences, endowing them with more than is there. But you have to say, it's quite an impressive start. So let's continue our Christmas Carol theme. And you'll remember that the first Christmas spirit to visit Scrooge is the spirit of Christmas past, which leads me to reflect on past AI. 50 years ago, we had Winograd Sherdlu. This is this rather engaging little blocks world where the system could just about move blocks in this toy domain and lift and place and variously move things about. It actually looks very quaint now. They had to literally film the screen. There was no way to capture it at the time. You can see that from the kind of wonky aspect ratio. But it demonstrates lots of problems, even though this is a 50-year-old program. Language understanding, planning and reasoning, it's executing a set of English instructions in this micro world. Now, we can look on that and it all looks rather quaint. But as I say, this traditional rule-based approach to language and processing turns out to be at the heart of many of our current AI systems, as well as the newer approaches in neural networks. Rules and reasoning have always been important. Explaining the reasons behind actions always been important. The other thing that I remember from my Christmases past is, well, perhaps some of you remember the Sinclair Zx81. This is the PC computing phenomena of its era back in the day. Clive Sinclair's single computer. that would plug into a TV and allow you to program away in BASIC. It was actually held up as a bit of a success of British manufacturing and entrepreneurship. There was a spat between Sinclair, Her Majesty's government, BBC on the introduction of discounted educational computers. But it did introduce a whole generation to computing. It introduced a whole generation to programming. Regrettably, I think it rather saw the emergence of a boys' hobby activity approach to programming. And we're still struggling there, I would say. And just looking back just a few decades now, a couple of decades to 1997, when of course we have the remarkable achievement of Deep Blue beating the world's greatest chess player here in the famous Game 6, the deciding game in a match that Kasparov lost. It was at this point that people really became rather unnerved by AI's potential. It's not just recent. In the past, we've grappled with these issues. It's just the scale we're at now that seems so very different. We should be impressed by what Deep Blue achieved. It was searching something like 200 million moves in the mid-game per second. It literally unnerved Kasparov. He was convinced there was a deep guiding mind in the program. So back to that issue of impressive, but what's really behind the system. So then we move on, of course, to the recognition that all of this power has been driven by extraordinary amounts of acceleration in our hardware, in our electrical engineering. And actually, you can just see the Zilog Z80 in the far left corner of that diagram, that plot of numbers of transistors against the year of introduction. Zilog Z80 is there. The foundation of Sinclair's machine had around about 8,000 transistors. The modern equivalent, the birthday or Christmas present of today, and we'll move on now to Dickens's Ghost of Christmas Present. What do we have? Well, we have the Raspberry Pi, a serious supercomputer by just the standards of a few decades ago. Again, making a play to introduce programming and computing into our schools, into our educational system, and still, I would submit a challenge about how to get the gender balance, girls, 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 into programming, into computational thinking, how to even get the sort of computational thinking and data literacy we need into a curriculum that's crammed full of other things, but an essential requirement. We have, of course, the supercomputers of our day are ubiquitous. There are smartphones in our pockets. Here is a processor of an iPhone that has 8 billion transistors or thereabouts. That's a modern version of an iPhone, literally 1 million times more powerful than the computer that was running Sinclair's machine. So it's pretty clear that with that increase in power, we're going to see an extraordinary increase in the opportunity of AI to be deployed everywhere. And those smartphones contain AI everywhere, from the voice recognition systems to the questions and answering system, to the fundamental ubiquity of everything that we do and live in nowadays, from smart devices that drive our cars to telemedicine. And so many changes that think back to the wonderful figure in Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim, crippled, deformed, actually under one reading, of course, deeply ill, poverty-struck. But of course, the physical disabilities are now literally things that are being dealt with by AI and robotics. And here we have this extraordinary set of technologies which are rendering literally a capability to deliver extraordinary changes in the world of disability. So we're becoming hugely familiar and used to these sorts of changes, these extraordinary changes. And just recently, in the pandemic context, we've seen this happen again. This is a British-based company, Benevolent AI. Many of you will probably be aware of the company, chaired by Joanna Shields, is the CEO. This is using modern AI techniques to search for drugs, therapeutics, to make discoveries in pharmacology. In fact, recently had granted by the FDA an emergency authorization to use an anti-inflammatory drug to help treat moderate to severe cases of COVID-19. These discoveries driven by AI knowledge-based systems and working in tandem with clinical expertise. And just most recently, of course, from DeepMind, who stunned the world with the defeat of the world's greatest Go player, we have AlphaFold. Life is literally powered by proteins. The functions of proteins determined by their three-dimensional shape. The proteins themselves are made of chains of amino acids. Sequences are read off, assembled, as we're seeing here in this animation. Our DNA codes for the production of proteins, and these long chains are generated to form three-dimensional shapes. The challenge was there are literally almost uncountable many ways in which those shapes can fold. A huge space, estimated to be something like 10 to the 1 to the power of 143. So the challenge is to work out how proteins fold, because their shape determines their function. And misfolds are responsible for disease. Misfolding is believed to be the cause of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, cystic fibrosis, Gaucher's disease, responsible for non-neurological defects like type 2 diabetes. So working out how proteins fold and how they might misfold, fundamentally important. The data on which AlphaFold works is open data. And I think this is an extraordinarily important point to make at this moment. Open data, millions of proteins for which we have a relatively small number mapped, about 170,000 protein 3D structures, which were used as the input to train the systems. AlphaFold has been using the latest programs to generate these structures, and many regard it as a breakthrough moment in biological science. Not just because we might more quickly design proteins that fix other misfolded proteins, we might actually assemble new tissues through assembling new kinds of protein, or we might improve health and aging research, or indeed biomaterials themselves might be designed that have not existed in nature before. So let's back to the story. Scrooge, famously a miser. What are we to say about a world in which perhaps some companies hoard the data that fuels these AI algorithms, that perhaps should imagine a better settlement across the place? And this is one of the reasons that Tim and I founded the Open Data Institute back in 2012, hugely proud of the UK's effort to make data available openly as possible. We recognize that we need to build a data environment that is healthy for everyone. So we don't want the data hoarders of the world, the data huggers of the world to predominate. We recognize that some data needs to be kept, protected, and harnessed and gathered. It can't all be shared openly. Some of it needs to remain private. But if we can make the foundation of our data as broad as possible, that's going to be a healthy ecosystem, generating endless applications to lead to innovation in our environment. So let's move on to the third spirit. This is the ghost of Christmas future. And this is the thing that hangs over us perhaps, is AI misapplied. Might it bring about our ultimate demise? From Terminator, weaponization of AI, you can see these things being realized right in front of us, which is one of the reasons I know the group, so importantly, thinks about ethics. At Oxford recently, we've set up an institute for the ethics of AI, and we are serious about trying to understand the challenges that exist for us in the ethical, legal, regulatory application of AI in application contexts. Well, back again to think about Christmas present, we may well be getting these devices through our Santa stockings, whether it's an Amazon IoT device or a smart teddy full of AI technology. This makes the spine, the coffee machine, look prosaic. We imagined a world, my co-author Kieran O'Hara and I, in which surveillance was everywhere. We have to be concerned that this is a reality, and we have to wonder what strangers we're inviting into our domestic settings, into all sorts of settings, or indeed giving over to our children to play and befriend. AI ethics isn't just a matter of weaponization, it's a matter of consumer-based AI now. I thought I'd just finish with a few reflections on just where AI is currently sitting with these prodigious neural networks we have. What you're seeing here is an extraordinary attempt to visualize the internal representations that might be being activated in the human visual system when it looks at an object in the real world. And this is work from the Kyoto University. And what we're seeing here is the attempt to reconstruct the visual features that are activated in an actual neural network that's been trained over these objects, and we're relating back to human visual equivalents. Tantalizingly suggestive of the intermediate representations of the visual world that we face. This interfacing of the physical world with the actual neural stimulus that our brains give off is also reflected in some extraordinary work from the Shark Lab. This is quite a while ago now, and here what we're doing is taking recordings from the cortex and trying to infer what the sounds are that are being generated, to the extent that models can be used to then infer the words that are being spoken. Now, the words you're about to hear.
To which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today.
We're starting to see the emergence, I think, here of serious brain-machine interfaces and the ability to use the prodigious power of our neural networks to decode aspects of our actual thought processes, whether that's the articulation of speech or the objects we're seeing around us. Well, let's finish then with a reflection on Marley. There's Marley, actually, as he kind of emerges in Scrooge's mind. Pareidolia, seeing things that aren't really there. And this is the famous application of another Google neural network phenomena, deep dream. Here we're applying the deep dream algorithm, and what the algorithm does, it kind of runs the neural network backwards. And a network that has been trained to recognize natural images is trying to find those images in the input image it's given. So it starts to reconstruct. It's like looking at the patterns we see in clouds in the sky. It's trying to find ways in which it might match its inputs to represent objects it sees. And it kind of strangely elaborates these images with almost a dreamlike quality. It can be quite scary, and certainly in the case of Marley there, but perhaps even more familiar objects who can be subject to a deep dream experience. There we see a couple of applications. It all gets rather bizarre and worrisome. And even our more familiar Tim, there he is. Tim has been subjected to deep dream here. Slight, there we go, Tim. There we are. The deep dream that is Tim. I thought I'd finish with one final reflection. At the end of a year in which has seen our social distancing so constrained, let's remember that our AI is what we choose to do with it, that we as human beings will decide how we deploy it. Our pure sociability, our common humanity, it's well illustrated, of course, in the part of the book where Scrooge is taken back to see himself as an earlier, younger man in jollity at Mr. Fezziwig's ball. Well, of course, modern COVID rules don't allow us to assemble in quite those numbers. And so perhaps let's end with the final illustration, which is Scrooge having a noggin with his his dear friend now, of course, Cratchit, and there we are. It's absolutely an extraordinary sense in which we as humans will shape and manage the world we live in, always with our humanity and our sense of sociability, one likes to think, intact. So thank you very much, and a happy Christmas to you all.
Nigel, thank you so much. I suppose I should count myself lucky that you didn't produce a deep fake or something.
No, nothing so.
But I must admit, great message there about don't be a Scrooge with your data, something along those lines. I think that's a very good message for the National Data Strategy, perhaps, or for our Competition and Markets Authority, maybe. So we've got some very good pointers there. Now I'm told that we've got that you're able to take a couple of questions. So I'd love to just pick up on any questions we've got. I don't know if we've got any in the chat. We've got mainly fantastic thank yous. And is there a link for that BCI listening to thoughts? Ah, yes, that's a very good point.
Yes, and there's a whole range of work now on trying to move. That's actually really trying to infer what the spoken words would have been just from brain activity. But people are trying to go further now and wonder whether the inner speech that we all kind of imagine we might occasionally hear can also be sonified or made audible. So there's quite a line of work on that. I can certainly, that was the Schalke lab that was doing the work that I can drop a link into the chat on that. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Tim, can I grab a question, please? Nigel, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, and for sparing the dream sequence from myself. I'm grateful for that. What you were just talking about there, again, I think has some ethical issues around it. If you were able to understand someone's thought rather than their action, it takes us into a whole new territory. Do you think we are ever going to be able to develop an ethical framework that is of fleet of foot enough to be able to cope with changes that we might not have even thought could be achieved?
Yeah, that is the great challenge, isn't it? And I think in some sense, that's why the ethics and the regulatory frameworks we do establish will be so important. It is moving so fast, but it was also moving fast, wasn't it, when we looked at the emergence of human fertilization and embryology, and when Warnock's great report, and then the bringing together of a framework in which work was permissioned. Now, here, in some sense, the technology is so cross-cutting that knowing where to see where the disruption might be is part of the challenge. But that's partly what the ethics of AI will have to be about. It will be to say, what is our reasonable expectation to privacy in a world in which these sorts of devices and capabilities exist? What does informed consent mean if I'm willing to allow certain sorts of prostheses to be used to allow me to communicate or interact with other people or devices? Sure, but what about the surveillance consequences of that? And we do have, of course, the law can adapt, and we do have a sense of the boundaries we want to establish. And to simply imagine that the technology brushes all of that aside, I think is to underestimate our ability to come to a settled position as a society about what we think is and is not an appropriate use of the methods and power we have at our disposal.
Thank you, Nigel. I've got one question, which I think we must treat as the last question, from Alpesh Doshi, saying the promise of AI and the delivery of AI for enterprises is still far apart. How can we accelerate the adoption of this in businesses?
That's a great point. I do think that there is so much unfinished business in the world of IT and automation. I mean, there's all the high-end AI we see, but in general, there is just so much that can still be done. We might think of a rather more routine way. A routine application, by the way, of AI has an advanced IT has changed our world. I mean, the fact we know precisely where we are most of the time with a combination of satellites, GPS, and applications that route find for us just gives you that sense of how the everyday can be changed and modified, and all sorts of organizations and services and businesses rely on that. So spreading out the benefits of AI across the piece, again, it's going to be hugely important that we have that we see this as a broad-based capability and not just the preserve of, if you like, a relatively concentrated technocratic elite. And that will be one of the challenges, I think, is for us to much more widely make the underpinning approaches, methods, and techniques available to the next generation as we educate, but also the consequences of this in terms of law and business and innovation. And this is almost happening despite some aspects of the educational curriculum to accommodate to it.
Yeah, and I'm going to rat on you. I'm going to take one final question, definitely final this time. To keep trust in AI, we need to have explainability. How far down the road have we reached in understanding how AI results can be explained? I thought that was such a good question that we ought to take it.
Yeah, well, there's a whole area of explainable AI, accountable AI. In the era when we built our AI systems using rule-based systems, we could look at the rule-based trace to have some idea of why the conclusion was reached in the way it is. And we still do for systems that operate in that way. They are important parts of how we make sense of the world we're designing and controlling. A whole range of logic-based methods, safety-critical methods, where you want to see how the system has gone through the various steps. The challenge with these very large network-based systems, there's a very interesting phenomena, which is that the field itself is having to develop something like neuroscience, like experimental neuroscience. It's called, AI neuroscience. It's how do you probe these large networks to understand what their internal states are, to see where they are, where the actual systems are going in the various stages of problem solving. Now, I think that we will see through time an integration of a range of AI techniques to help that process of making the black box less opaque.
Nigel, thank you very much. And thank you so much. I mean, if that wasn't an illustration of being a multiplier for human ingenuity, I don't know, the bringing in of the Christmas Carol, I thought was just perfect. You brought so many strands together as a result. But thank you, and it required quite a lot of preparation and thought. And thank you very much indeed.
I enjoyed that very much. Yeah.